All right, today we're diving into 10 possible futures for Iran, all coming from a really compelling analysis by Magdi Khalil. Now, this isn't just some academic thought experiment. It's rooted in a massive recent conflict that could totally reshape the Middle East. So let's break down what could happen next.
To really get how high the stakes are, we've got to start with this number, 8,500. According to the source, that's how many air and missile strikes Iran got hit with in just 6 days from US and Israeli forces. I mean, that is a staggering number, one of the most intense aerial attacks in modern history. And it's that single event that really unlocks all the different possibilities we're about to walk through.
So here's our game plan for looking at these 10 scenarios. We'll kick things off with the immediate fallout from that war. Then we'll get into 2 scenarios where power shifts inside the regime. After that, we'll look at 2 ways the country itself could actually break apart. From there, the analysis looks at a pretty terrifying total war scenario, before we wrap up with the 3 final endgame possibilities: the best, the worst, and the downright catastrophic. Right, so that initial conflict, it created a totally new reality. The whole point of this analysis is that Iran's military was so badly damaged that it pushed the country to this critical crossroads, It opened the door to futures that you just couldn't have imagined before. And this really shows you the scale of that damage. The source reports that 80% of Iran's air defenses were hit. 60% of its missile capabilities, gone. That led to a 90% drop in their missile launches by the end of that week. Oh, and they also lost about a third of their key naval forces. The bottom line is, the regime was left incredibly exposed, which really sets the stage for everything we're about to discuss. So this vulnerability opens the door to our first set of possibilities, and these all involve change coming from inside the regime itself. The first scenario is one the source calls the Venezuela model, and this is where the regime basically tries to cut a deal with its biggest enemy just to save its own skin. So the idea here is that a practical but still powerful figure inside the regime looks around and realizes, okay, this path is leading to total disaster. So they reach out to the United States and hammer out a deal to stop the country from completely collapsing. The goal here isn't democracy, not at all. It's just survival of the state, but in a new, less hostile form. Now, our second scenario is less about cutting a deal with the outside world and more about a fight breaking out on the inside, with different factions of the regime basically going to war with each other. In this version of the future, all that pressure from the conflict just causes things to crack. You see splits within Iran's security forces, the army, the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij, they all start to splinter. And according to the analysis, this chaos could actually empower the so-called reformist faction to push the extreme hardliners aside and try to make peace with the rest of the world to pull Iran back from the edge. Okay, from this point on, the scenarios get a lot scarier. We're moving beyond just political changes to possibilities where the very idea of Iran as a unified nation could get torn apart. This brings us to scenario number 3, a minority rebellion. It's easy to forget, but Iran is not one homogeneous country. And a moment of weakness for the regime could be the spark that lights some very old fires. And this chart really shows you why this is such a real possibility. Sure, ethnic Persians are the majority at about 60%. But you have these huge minority groups like Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, and the Baloch. Now, if these groups, especially the Kurds who have a long history of fighting for their own state, decide that this is their moment to make a move while the government is weak, well, that could easily trigger a civil war and the breakup of the country. But what if the regime doesn't just get weaker? What if it just vanishes, like overnight? That brings us to our fourth scenario, a sudden, total collapse that creates a terrifying power vacuum. According to the analysis, the regime's hardcore base of support is only about 20% of the population. So if it were to just suddenly disappear, what do you think the other 80%, many of whom have suffered for decades, might do? Well, you could see an explosion of revenge killings targeting members of the Revolutionary Guard and Basij, leading to absolute anarchy where nobody is in charge. All right, from here, things scale up dramatically. The next scenarios are not about Iran imploding on itself, but about the conflict exploding outwards, threatening the whole region, and maybe even the world. This leads us to scenario 7, which the source actually attributes to the former supreme leader, Khamenei, a last-ditch, scorched-earth plan called the Big Fire. The logic here is just as brutal as it sounds. Faced with defeat, the regime's thinking is, if we go down, we're taking everybody with us. So first, they shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which would choke off a huge chunk of the world's energy supply. Then, they start launching attacks on every neighbor they can hit. And the ultimate goal? To create so much chaos that global powers are forced to get involved, turning a local defeat into a massive global war.
And that brings us to our final section, which lays out three very, very different endgames. These are the most extreme possibilities, and they range from the incredibly hopeful to the absolutely terrifying.
Let's start by putting two polar opposite futures side by side. Our 8th and 9th scenarios are basically the two extremes, the best case outcome for the West and the absolute worst.
So on one side, you've got the rosy scenario. In this future, the regime just crumbles. The son of the last Shah, Reza Pahlavi, comes back to help with a peaceful transition, and Iran turns into a democracy allied with the West. Now on the other side, the nightmare scenario. Here, the regime somehow survives, picks an even more radical leader, and doubles down on the one thing it wants most: getting a nuclear bomb, no matter the cost. But there is one last possibility, Scenario 10. And this one goes beyond a nightmare into something genuinely apocalyptic. This is the catastrophic scenario. In this scenario, as the source lays it out, the regime is cornered, it's desperate, and it does the unthinkable. It launches some kind of crazy attack, maybe a crude chemical weapon or a strike on a nuclear facility. The response from the US and Israel would be immediate and absolutely overwhelming, leading to a massive mutual annihilation that would just devastate Iran on a scale we've never seen before. So the main takeaway from all of this is pretty clear: that initial conflict threw Iran into a state of total chaos. Magdi Khalil's analysis makes it clear that none of these 10 paths are a sure thing. The future is completely unwritten, and you could even see a mix of these scenarios happen at the same time, which just shows you how fragile everything is. And that leaves us with the ultimate question. From an internal power struggle to a global firestorm, the future of a country of 90 million people is completely up in the air. The path Iran chooses won't just decide its own fate, it's going to send shockwaves across the entire planet.